Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes, the story of Jonah and the whale. But because the book of Jonah in the Old Testament of the Bible is such a short book in its entirety, just being 4 chapters long, we're going to not only decode the well-known story of Jonah and the whale, but throughout this video piece, we're going to decode the entire book of Jonah found in the Old Testament, because as you are about to see, the story of Jonah and the whale is just the very beginning of a story that is encoding for an ancient way to keep a lunar calendar. So a lunar calendar is a calendar kept by tracking the moon's movements throughout the seasons. And there's various ways to do it. Various cultures have come up with various different ways to set a lunar calendar, and lunar calendars are also much older in many cases than are the solar calendars that are used today. So this is going back to perhaps even the time before writing, keeping in mind that when we were looking at the story of Orion in our last piece, that we were mentioning that some of these stories go back to even times before we even had writing. So the memory is the only way that these stories were passed down, and they were done so using mnemonic technologies like song, dance, costume, ritual, and storytelling. But it was done usually in a community setting, and it was so that you could be under the night sky, right? Acting these things out or singing songs about it so that it would be easier to remember the story, or telling the story as you're pointing to what's actually occurring in the heavens above all of our heads. So this is the first time we're going to look at a lunar calendar, and what we're going to do is just break down the story of Jonah as we go through it and read it. We're going to plug it into the sky story, and what we should see is that the sequence of how the story unfolds should also match how the seasons progress. And at least we're going to look from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective as we cue things up to start. And just reorienting everybody here as we're going to plug the story and the characters we find within it into the sky story, or the reality that cycles above all of our heads. When I read through the book of Jonah, I recognized a familiar pattern, and so we queued things up in Stellarium to start with at around the time of the winter solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere. The reason why is because that's a very common time of the year where many of these ancient calendars begin, and we're going to find out that this one does the same thing. So I queued up a screenshot in Stellarium, a free online program you can find yourself to verify everything that I'm going to show you here once again. But when you're orienting yourself to look at what's occurring in the sky, you want to look at that very special place in the sky. So from our Northern Hemisphere viewers' perspective, we're going to look due south, and we're going to pay attention to everything that's rising in the east and setting in the west on that red arc of the ecliptic. So that's where you're going to find all the known zodiac constellations, the sun, the moon, and all the known planets. They all rise in the east and set in the west in this very narrow band in the sky. The special crossing point of the north-south meridian line, that green line there, is a very special place, very special crossing point, and it's at this place in the sky. So underneath that red arc of the ecliptic there to the horizon of the earth, this area is where all this action that we keep finding over and over again being described in these stories all occurs in. And so we're looking again at the all-seeing eye, or the real oracle, as I've been calling it, that same area in the sky. So once again, that's what's queued up in Stellarium, and we're looking at the date commonly called December 23rd of 2020 at midnight as we begin. So let's start reading the book of Jonah from chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Now, before I go any further, this is the public domain version of the King James Version of the Bible, so some of the language is going to be archaic, but you're going to get the gist. Don't worry. All right, so we're going to go on in verse 3. But Jonah rose up to flee into Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it, to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. Then the mariners were afraid, and cried every man unto his God, and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea, to lighten it of them. But Jonah was gone down in the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. So the shipmaster came to him and said unto him, What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not. All right, so before we go on to verse 7, let's just plug in some things we've already been given as clues. If you look down in the southern horizon there, you're going to see some familiar constellations that we've already looked at in previous pieces, in Puppis and Pyxis. So remember, Puppis is the stern of the ship. Puppis is one of 3 constellations that used to be one huge constellation called Argo, or the ship. So Puppis is that broken up ship, the stern of it, and it's right there on the southern horizon. And then right next to it, that line, is Pyxis, otherwise known as the mariner's compass. So that tells us, from the clues that we've been given so far in the story of Jonah and the whale, that we are indeed in the right place and in the right time of the year. But who's Jonah? We haven't plugged that in yet, so we read on, and we will certainly, by the end of chapter 1, answer that question. So let's continue on. And they said every one to his fellow, Come and let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this evil is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Jonah. Then they said unto him, Tell us, we pray thee, for whose cause this evil is upon us. What is thine occupation, and whence comest thou? What is thy country, and of what people art thou? Okay, so that's pretty archaic there, but they're questioning him, right? Where do you come from? What do you do? Who are your people? All that. It goes on. And he said unto them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, which hath made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said unto him, Why hast thou done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then said they unto him, What shall we do unto thee, that the sea may be calm unto us? For the sea wrought, and was tempestuous. And he said unto them, Take me up, and cast me forth into the sea, so that the sea shall be calm unto you. For I know that for my sake this great tempest is upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring it to land, but they could not, for the sea wrought, and was tempestuous against them. Wherefore they cried unto the Lord, and said, We beseech thee, O Lord, we beseech thee, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for thou, O Lord, hast done as it pleased thee. So they took up Jonah, and cast him forth into the sea, and the sea ceased from her raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So, knowing from previous pieces that this entire area of the sky has been described many times as the celestial sea, where you find plenty of constellations named after things you would find in the sea, just like we looked at with Puppis and Pyxis, but also sea monsters and sea creatures, just like we see over here right above the western horizon, focusing on this constellation called Cetus. This is a constellation that in ancient myths and legends many times has been described as a big fish or a sea monster, and nowadays Cetus is the whale. And if you look up people who study whales here on Earth, whale experts, you're going to find that they're called cetologists, which references this constellation's name. So Cetus the whale is over the western horizon here, and if you look at where the moon is in alignment with Cetus, you will see that the moon is actually in the belly of Cetus, or the whale. So we're going to plug in Jonah playing the moon in this sky story, and we're going to go forward for 3 days and see if the sequence that we've just followed in the story from chapter 1 of the book of Jonah, and the story of Jonah and the whale specifically, is going to hold. So we start out in what is commonly called December 23rd of 2020, the first day that the moon is found to be in the belly of the constellation of the whale. The following day, we go forward to what we commonly call December 24th of 2020 at midnight. And once again, you can see the constellation of Cetus still above the western horizon. And the moon still is in conjunction with this constellation. Second day, a little bit further up in the constellation of Cetus, but still for the second day, Jonah, or the moon, is found to be in the belly of the whale. Going forward one more day to what we commonly call December 25th of 2020, what Christians practice and celebrate as Christmas. At midnight, we can see that the constellation of Cetus, still above the western horizon, is still in alignment with the moon. And for the third day, you see the moon in the constellation of Cetus, risen a little bit higher, again, in above the western horizon, and the moon is specifically in the mouth of the constellation of Cetus, or Jonah is in the mouth of the whale at this point. So let's continue to read on. Chapter 2. So after 3 days, right, of being in the belly of the whale, this is where the story picks up. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cried reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. For thou hast cast me into the deep, in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. All thy billows and all thy waves passed over me. Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight, yet I will look again toward thy holy temple. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about, and the weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came unto thee, into thine holy temple. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. But I will sacrifice unto thee with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay that I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. And the Lord spake unto the fish, and it vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. So, plugging in a couple of things that we've been told in this particular part of the story before we go forward, I want you to know that the Holy Temple is looking toward going further up, right, to this special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the ecliptic. And I also want to point out the very poetic, it's beautiful language, right, that this story is written with. And consider that the reason for much of this very poetic language that's very symbolic and intense oftentimes is because that's a better mnemonic trick, right? It's a technique to make stories easier to remember, especially in times before writing. All right, so notice after the third day, right, we ended this verse, the Lord spake into the fish, and it vomited out Jonah onto the dry land after 3 days, right? So we go forward the fourth day. After that 3 days, what is commonly called December 26th of 2020 at midnight, and we can see the constellation of Cetus still above the western horizon, and the moon has moved even higher, has been, in fact, right, in the sky story, Jonah has been vomited out from the whale's mouth and has made it to dry land. As we continue this story on, we're queuing up a screenshot in Stellarium, now to the time in the Northern Hemisphere where we're just ending the winter season and moving into spring, right? So we started out at the winter solstice, so now in sequence, as our seasons unfold here in the Northern Hemisphere, the next crossing point, right, for seasons in the sky story should be from moving from winter into spring. So this is a screenshot we've queued up in Stellarium following the story through for what we commonly call March 2nd of 2020 at around midnight. And we're going to notice that Jonah is the moon, right, over here in the western horizon. Difficult to see because, unfortunately, the Stellarium screenshot gives us a big tree there. But you can still see I've got the arrow pointing to where the moon is. And it's the first day that the moon is going to be found at midnight to be above the western horizon at this point. It's in the constellation of Taurus, and Taurus is descending in the western horizon as well this time of year. And I also want to point out the constellation of Auriga right above Taurus, because we're going to start plugging in some characters once again from what we read on, continuing in chapter 3 of the book of Jonah. So this is after, right, in context, that Jonah had been in the belly of the whale, and for 3 days he then was spit out. So chapter 3 continues. And the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go unto Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee. So let's stop there, because as we noticed in the previous piece with the story of Orion, it was the first time that we were mentioning that in many of these stories, ancient myths and legends, within the story are referencing places that are actual places on Earth. But as we're going to find over and over again, as we have already, that in these stories, they are coupled, these places on Earth, with places that are identifiable in the story as places also so named in the celestial space. So in this case, Nineveh, which you also want to notice is a mnemonic device in itself. It's heaven spelled backwards, if you hadn't noticed that already. But Nineveh, the city that is being referenced in this particular story, is going to be that very special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic. So Nineveh is going to be referencing as a city, but in the story, it's in the sky story, it's that very special crossing point that comes up over and over again in so many of these stories. All right, so continuing on in verse 3. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh. So that's what we see over here in the western horizon, right? The moon at this time of year is arising, and night after night after night is going to be found to have risen higher in the west here, over the western horizon, and will be making its way higher and higher to the special crossing point of the north-south meridian line, or the ecliptic, in this story called Nineveh, or heaven backwards. Okay, and so it goes on. And Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, and he cried and said, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. 40 days. We've seen that, I think, in almost every piece that we've decoded when we've looked at the sky story. So this is, again, referencing that season of sacrifice, what is practiced in the modern day by practicing Christians as the season of Lent, right? It's that 40 days leading up to the holiest time of year for practicing Christians, and specifically Roman Catholics, which would lead up to commemorating the character of Jesus in the story, his crucifixion and then his resurrection on Easter Sunday. So let's see if we've pinpointed the right time of the year. Once again, this 40-day season of sacrifice, or Lent as it's practiced nowadays, because we're looking at the same time frame, right? It's the same coming at the end of winter, going into the newborn spring. That's what this season of sacrifice story is actually about. And we've seen it play out in solar calendar narratives, but this is the first time that we're seeing it even in a more ancient form in a lunar calendar narrative. So let's continue and see if the imagery matches everything that we know about this particular time of year and how it's been described in the past. So the people of Nineveh believed God, the book of Jonah goes on to say in verse 5, and proclaimed a fast. Oh, there we go. And put on a sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them. So, okay, this is already referencing the same type of season of sacrifice imagery, right? Let's continue. For word came unto the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, and he laid his robe from him, and covered him with sackcloth, and set in ashes. So that's why I pointed out the constellation of Taurus over here in the west, conjunct with the moon, and above it the constellation of Auriga. As we've seen in previous pieces, the constellation of Taurus is often, in many stories, represented as a king, especially when it's in alignment like this with the constellation of Auriga. And you could see for your own self why this would make sense, where it looks as if the constellation of Auriga, which is known these days to be a chariot, is actually shaped like a crown, and crowning, in fact, the constellation of Taurus, which is often represented as a king figure or a leader figure in many of these stories. So there he is on the west, going to descend down into the Earth's horizon, right, at this time of year in the northern hemisphere. So will no longer soon be visible above the Earth's horizon at all at this time at midnight. So he's set in ashes. That's what that imagery is meant to imply. Let's go on. Verse 7. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed nor drink water. So again, fasting, sacrificing, same imagery. But let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn every one from his evil way and from the violence that is in their hands. Who can tell if God will turn and repent and turn away from his fierce anger, that we perish not? And God saw their works, and that they turned from their evil way, and God repented of the evil that he said that he would do unto them, and he did it not. So putting this in context, the season of sacrifice that would go along with the whole idea of moving from the end of winter into spring, you can see that ancient peoples might have gotten the idea that they could offer up sacrifice and, have some internal reflection, getting closer to God, fasting and praying, offering up the hope that God will return or hear their prayers, right, and accept their offerings and their sacrifices by blessing the world once again with the sun returning and warmer weather, where things are greened up once again and plants continue their cycle to be reborn and grow again. It is the ensuring of our species as a whole, right? When spring returns and food will grow again to sustain us for another year. All right, so on what we commonly call March 2nd of 2020 at midnight, you're going to find, when we calculate a 40-day time frame, we're going to start here where the moon, or Jonah, is found to be above the western horizon. And what I want to show you is when we go forward to what we commonly call March 13th of 2020, it's during the same time frame, right, at midnight, you can see it took 11 days at that point, right, for Jonah, or the moon, now from making his travels from above the western horizon, now will be found to be above the eastern horizon. But this is going to be the last night you're going to find Jonah, or the moon, above the eastern horizon this time of year at midnight, because the following night Jonah, or the moon, is going to be descended below the Earth's horizon and continue his journey into the underworld, right, or the southern hemisphere journey that the moon is going to make along the arc of the ecliptic, and come back up and around again to be found here above the western horizon again. So once that happens, it's going to make its way again to find where we find Jonah, or the moon, located exactly at the same place where we left it. So keep that in mind. The place that we're leaving Jonah, or the moon, in this time frame over here and above the eastern horizon of the Earth is what we commonly call March 13th of 2020 at midnight. And when we look almost a month later, we're going to see it takes that long for the moon to get back around to that same location. And if you look at the date, it is what we commonly call April 11th of 2020, or the day before Easter Sunday this year, right? That's already passed by the time we're doing this video piece here, but it's the last day that the moon is going to be found risen above the Earth's horizon in the northern hemisphere at midnight. It's going to make its journey back into the underworld, in other words, after this night. So when you calculate up the time frame, once again, right around that 40-day season of sacrifice period, same time of year, but looked at from a lunar calendar perspective. Now, if we're correct, the same sequence we should see play out in the book of Jonah should go all the way through and take us to the end of a lunar calendar then, right? All the way through the seasons that we would see play out on Earth in actuality or in reality. So chapter 4 of the book of Jonah is the last chapter of this book, and that should take us through right to the end of the year and back to the beginning where we started in our story of Jonah and the whale. So I've queued up a screenshot in Stellarium as we follow the story through for the fall time or autumn here in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly what we commonly call October 30th of 2020 at midnight. And we're going to pick the story of Jonah back up and start plugging once again the elements from the story into the sky story, and they should sync up perfectly. All right, so chapter 4 goes on. So after Jonah went through all of this with being in the belly of the whale, and then he, has this journey with the city of Nineveh and what's going on there, he has come now to the next part of his journey, and it begins, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. And he prayed unto the Lord and said, I pray thee, O Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? Therefore I fled before unto Tarshish. For I knew that thou art a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil. Therefore now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Then said the Lord, Doest thou well to be angry? So Jonah went out of the city, and sat on the east side of the city, and there made him a booth, and sat under it in the shadow, till he might see what would become of the city. And the Lord God prepared a gourd, and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shadow over his head, to deliver him from his grief. So Jonah was exceedingly glad of the gourd. But God prepared a worm when the morning rose the next day, and it smote the gourd, that it withered. Now, this is becoming highly symbolic, right? Even more so than all the ashes and sackcloth and fasting and all that we were given in chapter 3. But let's decode it because the sky story makes it really easy. All right, so looking at the fall or autumn on what is commonly called October 30th of 2020. Notice this is the day before we commonly celebrate Halloween. So take a look at Jonah, played by the moon here in the sky story, and notice his location. The moon is found to be on the west side of that special crossing point, right? No, Nineveh in the story throughout it. It's been Nineveh here represented by the special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the ecliptic. So the moon is found on the west side of it. And along with it, notice what is right next to it. That's the planet Mars, that orange disk. This could definitely be representative of the gourd, right, being it's orange in color and found here during autumn, specifically on this day at midnight. And it's also in the constellation of Pisces, which could also be further indication that it's Mars in conjunction with Pisces as well, but it could be the constellation of Pisces all by itself. Pisces is known as the two fishes, of course, but if you just look at the shape of the constellation, you could see very easily that ancient people might also describe it looking like something that's like a vine with a gourd hanging on the end of it. And of course, the gourd is a strange symbol, perhaps, but makes perfect sense, right? When you think about it logically, that gourds are things that are harvested in the fall, and at least in the northern hemisphere. So the imagery of a gourd helps us know that we're looking at the right time of the year as we're keeping track of the moon, right, in this lunar calendar. But at the last verse that we left off, keep in mind that Nineveh, right, is the city that's referencing the cross of the north-south meridian line in the ecliptic in this story. And on this night, what we commonly call October 30th of 2020, Jonah is found with Pisces and Mars on the west side of this crossing point. But when we go forward the next night, you're going to see he's on the other side of this crossing point. And it will make sense then when you see that God sent a worm to smote and wither the gourd, the separation of Jonah, or the moon, from the conjunction of Mars and Pisces on the other side of this crossing point makes sense when you're looking at it from the sky stories perspective. All right, so going forward in the story, it ends, the book of Jonah, starting with verse 8. And what we queued up here in Stellarium is a screenshot of a different perspective, right? Instead of midnight, we're looking at high noon. And the reason that we're doing so is because what we're given as clues in the book of Jonah and how it ends tells us to. So we also should expect that sequentially in a calendar, right, it's going to end where it began. So coming out of autumn or fall in the northern hemisphere where we just were, we should expect that that's going to now take us into the winter season, right, as the seasons unfold here in reality on Earth. So let's go on with verse 8 as we're looking at a screenshot of what is commonly called January 12th of 2021 at high noon this time. And it came to pass when the sun did arise, that's our first clue, why we're looking at high noon this time, that God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat upon the head of Jonah, that he fainted, and wished in himself to die, and said, It is better for me to die than to live. And God said to Jonah, Doest thou well to be angry for the gourd? And he said, I do well to be angry, even to death. Then said the Lord, Thou hast had pity in the gourd for which thou hast not labored, neither made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. Okay, so let's stop there before we end the book of Jonah with this last verse. Take a look at what's going on in the sky story. So it would make sense, we're getting another reference about the gourd, another reminder, Jonah's still mad about the gourd, and he's talking about death, which is oftentimes a reference, death imagery, to winter imagery, right? Because it makes logical sense that, at least here in the northern hemisphere, the winter time is where, after the harvest is done and the sun moves from its farthest location from where we are, it becomes cold and food no longer grows. So it's a dormant time and things die. So that's the death imagery that we should expect if we've located the sky story correctly in wintertime, which we have. So as we go on, I want to take it back to the top. The reason it's high noon this time is because the story tells us so. The sun is out and beating on the head of Jonah. So take a look at where the sun is at high noon, that very special crossing point, and it's referenced yet again, the city of Nineveh. As we close things out, you'll see the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic has been the city of Nineveh, and it's been referenced throughout the story. The sun is sitting at that special crossing point, or right there at Nineveh, or heaven, spelled backwards. And that dark spot we've seen before in previous pieces, and we've seen this alignment. It happens repeatedly, and that dark spot is the moon. So that's where Jonah is this time of year, the sun beating on its head. Now, the death imagery could be, this as well. When the sun and the moon are conjunct at high noon, the sun's light is far too bright for you to see the moon out, right? So better for me to die than to live would make sense, as Jonah isn't seen. He's hidden. He's occulted. And it's in the season of death, or winter, as this book of Jonah is closing out here. So here's how we find out that we've been correct and we have fully decoded the way that this lunar calendar is kept. And ironically, it's done so in this very mysterious sounding verse 11 as things close out here in the conclusion of the book of Jonah. So let's see here. In verse 11 it ends, "And should I not spare Nineveh?" All right, so we know we're in the right place, right? The special crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the ecliptic. "And should I not spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 60,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle?" Now, that sounds very mysterious, but if you're looking at the sky story, it makes perfect sense. Take a look. Not being able to discern between their right hand and left hand in this city of Nineveh, or heaven spelled backwards. Well, Jonah, being the moon, is found on the west side of the north-south meridian line and the special crossing point of the ecliptic. But of course, the next day, we're going to find at high noon that he'll have moved to the other side of that special crossing point. So that makes sense, discerning between the right hand and the left hand in this verse. And then further, it sounds weird talking about discerning between much cattle. Well, in the sky story, if you take a look at the constellations, which are on both the right and the left side of Jonah, or the moon, at the special crossing point, the north-south meridian line in the ecliptic, or Nineveh, you see the constellation of Capricorn and the constellation of Sagittarius. Now, Capricorn nowadays is known as the goat, but you can see, as you're looking at the sky picture, you can see how ancients might interpreted that same picture as cattle, perhaps, and equally so on the other side, where Sagittarius sits, the centaur, half man, half horse, known as it is nowadays, the shape could also have been interpreted by ancients as cattle, sitting on the other side. This is proof positive that this is once again a story of just yet another way to keep a calendar. It is the first time that we've seen it decoded from a lunar calendar perspective, but it syncs up perfectly when we sync it up with the sky story that we're provided with this very powerful tool known as Stellarium that you can find for yourself to verify everything I've just taken you through. We're going to end things here and just meditate on the fact that many of these stories have come from times so ancient we didn't even have writing. So many of these stories were encoded in a way that made it easy to remember and could be easily passed down. This knowledge from each of us over time, so that we would have more knowledge about how to navigate the land and the seas of our earth that the Creator gave us as a blessing to travel around and explore and get to know one another and establish connections, and the connection to the Creator, who is such a brilliant intelligence to have designed such a magnificent timepiece and a way to keep a calendar to begin with. It's something to meditate on and marvel at, that the same Creator put within each and every one of us, the Creator-given senses that we were blessed with, and the presence of mind to make these connections for ourselves so that we could expand our consciousness and feel more connected, not just to the earth, the people, and the animals and plants and everything that are here with us, but also to the heavens that have cyclically turned, perhaps eternally, above all of our heads. We'll end things there and pick it back up next time when we decode yet another, perhaps ancient story or a modern tale. But until then, be well.